The day they voted me out of my own company, my son Robert handed me the resolution papers across the conference table I had occupied for 38 years. He spoke a rehearsed sentence about the best interests of the business. I looked at each face around that table, faces belonging to people I had hired, trained, and trusted across 3 decades, and not a single one of them met my eyes. I signed the documents without argument. I picked up my briefcase, walked to the elevator, descended to the parking garage, sat in my car, and made a single phone call before I started the engine. That one call was the beginning of everything that followed. But to understand what I did after walking out of that room, you need to understand what that company had cost me to build. You need to understand who I was before my sons decided that 75 was too old to lead the operation I had carried from nothing into a significant regional force. You need to understand the decisions made at 4 in the morning across 38 years, the risks accepted when no rational person would have accepted them, and the clients who chose to trust me personally through 3 decades of changing markets. Walking out with their papers signed was not defeat. It was the moment a different kind of plan began, and I already knew exactly what form it would take. Before I continue, I want to ask something of you. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and do that now. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from, whether nearby or on the other side of the earth. If you have ever been told that your time was finished by people who owe their entire position to the foundation you built for them, this story belongs to you. This community is built for people who understand that experience is not a liability, and that the most dangerous mistake any inheritor can make is underestimating the person who created what they are inheriting. Now let me tell you exactly how that lesson was delivered. My name is Walter. I am 75 years old. I founded my company, an industrial supply and logistics operation, at 37 after spending a full decade learning the trade from the warehouse floor upward. I had no inherited capital, no family connections in the industry, and no safety net if the business failed. What I had was a precise understanding of how supply chains functioned when working correctly, and an even more precise understanding of what caused them to fail under pressure. The first years were difficult in the specific way the first years of any real enterprise are difficult. The difficulty was not incidental, but structural, embedded in every decision about cash flow, client acquisition, and operational capacity. I survived them through discipline. My wife Clara died 11 years ago, and the space her death left in my personal life was one that no professional achievement could fill. But the company continued to grow, and in the years following her death, I brought my 2 sons into the operation. Robert as commercial director, James as operations manager. I did this because I believed in earned succession, in the idea that people inheriting what you built should first understand how it was built. I gave them authority proportional to demonstrated understanding. For several years, this arrangement worked well. Robert had sharp commercial instincts. James understood logistics. I believed I was watching the beginning of something that would carry the company beyond what I alone could create. The company was more than a revenue figure or a client list. It was the most concrete expression of a set of beliefs I had held since the beginning. That reliability was the rarest commodity in any market, that clients who trusted you would stay through conditions that drove them away from competitors, and that a reputation built slowly through consistent performance was the only kind of reputation that actually protected a business when conditions grew difficult. The name I had given it, simply my initial and the word solutions, was deliberately modest. I had always believed the business would speak more clearly than any name. For 38 years, I was right about that. The client relationships were the foundation of everything else. I had spent 3 decades building them, not through entertainment or favorable contracts alone, but through the less visible work of being present when problems arose, being reachable when problems did not wait for business hours, and understanding each client's operation well enough to anticipate difficulties before they became crises. Several of my longest-standing clients had been with me since the company's first decade. Their procurement staff changed multiple times, but the relationship always transferred because it was grounded in actual performance rather than personal chemistry alone. That was the asset my sons were taking control of. They did not fully understand what it was or how it had been built. The market knowledge was harder to transfer than the client relationships and took longer to accumulate. I knew which suppliers were reliable under pressure and which became unreliable at precisely the moments when reliability mattered most. I knew which segments were growing and which were contracting before the pattern appeared in any report. I knew the difference between a client who was expanding and a client who was managing decline, and I knew this not from financial statements, but from the specific texture of their purchasing decisions over time. This knowledge required 38 years of direct immersion to acquire. No strategy presentation, no graduate curriculum, and no board resolution could substitute for it or accelerate the timeline required to develop it. Robert and James did not see the distinction between updating a company and removing its founder. They saw an established operation and a founder whose methods reflected an earlier era. They were not entirely wrong that evolution was necessary. The market was changing, and I had already begun updating specific processes and technology systems. But they interpreted the need for evolution as evidence that the founder himself had become the problem. This misreading is common among heirs who have observed the results of decades of work without experiencing the decades themselves. They mistake the product for its origins. They assume the relationships will transfer automatically because they transferred to them, not understanding that they transferred because I transferred them personally. Robert began bringing proposals to the board without my prior review. He framed this as organizational efficiency, as the company maturing past the point where every decision required the founder's direct input. James aligned with Robert on operational decisions that had previously been made collaboratively. The pattern was deliberate and incremental, each individual change small enough to appear reasonable in isolation, the cumulative effect significant enough to alter the balance of authority in the organization. I noticed it and chose not to confront it directly. My sons took my silence as acquiescence. It was not acquiescence. It was observation. I was watching and recording and waiting to understand the full scope of what they were preparing. 2 new board members appeared on a meeting agenda without prior introduction or consultation with me. I met them for the first time when they sat down at the table. Both had been recruited by Robert. Both shared his view that the company's future required a different kind of leadership. Their presence on the board shifted the vote arithmetic in ways that were not accidental. The restructuring had been planned across several months at a level of coordination that required my sons to have spent considerable time working together on a project they had kept entirely separate from our working relationship. Understanding the extent of that coordination told me everything I needed to know about what the meeting I was about to attend was actually for. Robert had a conversation with me 3 weeks before the board meeting in which he suggested, with the careful tone of someone who has rehearsed a difficult message, that the company might benefit from a clearer leadership structure going forward. He said it was about positioning the business for the next phase of growth. He mentioned that the board had been discussing a formal transition. He did not say what the transition would involve, and I did not ask, because I already understood. I had watched this kind of conversation happen to other founders in the region, and I recognized its shape. I thanked Robert for sharing his thoughts. I told him I would give the matter serious consideration. I went home and called my lawyer. My lawyer advised me to review every provision in the founding shareholder agreement before the board meeting. She was thorough and unhurried. The agreement contained specific clauses about the compensation due to a founding shareholder in the event of a board-initiated leadership change, clauses I had written with considerable care when the business was small enough that such provisions had seemed precautionary rather than immediately relevant. Those clauses were now the most important document in my professional life. My lawyer walked through each one. The settlement they would be required to provide under the agreement was substantially larger than my sons had likely calculated. That figure, already forming in my mind during the meeting itself, was the beginning of the plan. The board meeting lasted less than an hour. The resolution had been drafted and circulated in advance. The vote was conducted with procedural efficiency. Robert presented the transition as being in the company's best interests. The board members who had known me for years said nothing of substance. The two new members Robert had recruited voted as expected. I was offered an advisory role at a nominal fee, which I declined without explanation. I signed the transfer documents, accepted the founding settlement my lawyer had confirmed I was entitled to, thanked the room without elaborating on my thanks, and left. From the parking garage, I called my financial advisor. He answered before the second ring. My financial advisor had known about Meridian Industrial for some time before that call. Meridian was based 20 miles from my former operation, served overlapping market segments, and had been struggling under management that had overextended during a period of market contraction. The owner, a man named Frank, had been quietly seeking a buyer for 18 months without finding the right combination of price and capability. My advisor had considered mentioning the situation to me on more than one occasion. He had not, because until that afternoon there had been no obvious reason for me to be interested in acquiring a competitor when I was still running my own company. That reason now existed clearly. I met Frank at a restaurant he had chosen, a quiet place where he was evidently a regular. He was 71 years old, direct in the way of a man who has spent decades in an industry where directness saves time, and carrying the fatigue of someone who has sustained something through will alone pass the point of finding satisfaction in it. We spoke for 3 hours. Within the first hour, we understood each other with the clarity that comes when two people have spent decades in the same industry and immediately recognize what the other person has lived through. Within the second hour, we were discussing acquisition parameters. Before the third hour ended, we had shaken hands on terms that were fair to him and strategically sound for me. My lawyer was involved within 24 hours of the handshake. The due diligence confirmed what the initial conversations had suggested. Meridian had sound operational bones, a client base with growth potential, and a management situation that had constrained both. Frank had maintained the business's essential infrastructure while deferring investment in areas that were now limiting its capacity to compete. The acquisition price was structured to reflect current performance rather than potential, which meant it was substantially below what the business would be worth once properly managed. The full transaction closed in 8 weeks. During those 8 weeks, I told no one in my family what I was doing. I attended the retirement dinner my sons organized in my honor approximately 3 weeks after signing the letter of intent. Robert gave a speech about legacy and knowing when to pass the torch to the next generation. He spoke about my decades of contribution and the company's future under new leadership. I listened from the head of the table with the attentiveness of someone who had already begun building what would eventually become the most significant competitive challenge that new leadership would face. I thanked Robert graciously. I accepted the framed photograph of the original office building. I shook hands with everyone present. I said nothing about Meridian. I left at a reasonable hour and drove home. The signing of the Meridian acquisition documents occurred on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the retirement dinner. I sat in my lawyer's office, reviewed the final terms, and completed the transaction that transferred ownership of a functioning industrial supply operation to me for the second time in my professional life. The circumstances were entirely different from the first time, when I had been 37 years old with no capital reserves and no existing relationships to leverage. Now I was 75, with a settlement that provided the acquisition capital, relationships that represented 3 decades of accumulated trust, and a level of market knowledge that would have cost any buyer years to develop independently. I signed the documents and went home to have lunch. Once I owned Meridian, I invested immediately in 3 areas that Frank's cautious management had deferred: the sales function, the client relationship infrastructure, and the technology systems that were limiting operational capacity. I had the resources, the industry knowledge, and a clarity of purpose that I had not felt since the company's earliest years. There is a particular quality of energy that comes from building something when you already understand what works, when you are not learning an industry for the first time, but applying accumulated knowledge to a structure that needs someone who knows what to do with it. I felt that energy from the first week of ownership. It had not diminished by the last. I brought in 2 people from my professional history whose judgment I trusted entirely: a sales director I had worked alongside for 20 years, and an operations consultant who had helped me through a difficult period in the earlier business. They understood the opportunity immediately. Both had observed Meridian from the outside for years and had their own assessments of where its potential had been constrained. Within 30 days, we had rebuilt the sales approach around priorities that reflected market knowledge accumulated over decades. The speed at which the changes took effect confirmed something I had always believed: that the difference between an underperforming business and a functioning one is frequently a matter of knowing what you are doing rather than what you are spending. The relationship work began before the operational improvements were fully visible in the revenue numbers. I contacted clients I had served across 38 years, not to recruit them directly, but to reestablish the conversations that had been the foundation of those relationships. Several of them had been observing the management transition at my former company with concern. The relationships they had valued were grounded in specific knowledge and specific history that did not automatically transfer with an organizational chart. When I called to introduce what I was building at Meridian, the response was consistent. They had been wondering when they would hear from me, and they were glad the wait had not been longer. 12 client accounts moved to Meridian within the first 4 months. Each departure was the result of a client's own decision, made based on their own assessment of where their supply needs would be best served. Several of them communicated their reasoning explicitly to their former account contacts at my old company. The change in leadership had altered the quality and depth of the relationship in ways they were not willing to accept as permanent. The speed of the account movement surprised no one at Meridian. It surprised nearly everyone at my former company. The gap between those 2 reactions illustrated the central difference between understanding a business and owning one. Robert and James noticed the account departures because they appeared immediately in the revenue figures, and because several clients had explicitly cited the leadership change as their reason for leaving. The initial analysis my sons conducted attributed the movement to general market disruption and increased competitive pressure from a strengthening Meridian operation. That attribution was partially accurate. What it missed was the specific cause of Meridian's strengthening. They studied the market data, reviewed their pricing, examined their service delivery metrics. The numbers told them a competitor was outperforming them. The numbers did not tell them who was running that competitor or why that person's involvement was the explanation for every pattern they were observing. 3 months passed before Robert connected the account movement to me specifically. During those 3 months, he hired additional sales staff, offered improved contract terms to accounts showing signs of movement, and brought in an external consultant to review the company's competitive positioning. None of these measures produced the results he needed because none of them addressed the actual variable driving the competition. I was not competing with my former company through pricing advantages or service improvements alone. I was competing through the specific combination of relationships and market knowledge that my former company had assumed would remain available to them after they removed the person who had spent 38 years building it. That assumption was the error everything else followed from. Robert called me on a Tuesday morning. The call lasted 47 seconds before he ended it. He did not call back for a week. When he finally did, his voice carried a quality I had not heard from him since he was young enough to be genuinely surprised by consequences. He accused me of acting from spite. I told him I was acting from business sense, that I had acquired an underperforming competitor and improved it. which was precisely what any investor with available capital and relevant knowledge would do. I told him the clients who had moved had made their own decisions and that I had no authority over those choices. I told him competition was legal and that I had violated no agreement. He was not comforted. James called the following day. His approach was different from Robert's, less accusatory, more pragmatic. He asked whether there was room for some arrangement that might reduce the competitive pressure their company was experiencing. I told him I had no authority to prevent clients from making their own sourcing decisions. He did not pursue the conversation further. The consulting firm they engaged later that month reportedly recommended that the company reduce its dependency on legacy client relationships and develop new business through different channels. My sons paid a substantial fee for a recommendation that described, with professional terminology, the precise problem they had created for themselves by removing the person those legacy relationships had been built around. By the end of the second year, Meridian had grown substantially in revenue, market share, and operational capacity. We were the preferred supplier to accounts that represented a meaningful portion of the revenue projections my former company had built its next strategy around. Robert had reduced his own compensation to cover operational shortfalls. James had restructured the operations function under new management after losing 2 senior staff members who had worked with me for over a decade. The board that had voted me out with such procedural confidence was meeting with considerably greater frequency and considerably less composure than it had shown in that original conference room. I heard all of this through the ordinary channels of a regional market where information travels at the speed of conversation. I ran Meridian for 3 years before selling it to a larger regional company that wanted access to our client base and operational structure. The transaction was handled by my financial advisor and my lawyer, and completed at a figure considerably larger than the settlement I had received when removed from my original business. When the signing was done, I sat in the same chair where I had completed the Meridian acquisition and thought about the full arc of events from the parking lot phone call to the document in front of me. The mathematics were not complicated. I had been removed from a company I built. I had built another company. I had sold it at a profit. The arc was complete, and it was entirely satisfying. Robert came to my kitchen a year after the sale. He said he had thought about the decisions he had made and believed some of them had been wrong. He did not specify which ones, and I did not press him. I told him I appreciated him saying so. I told him the company he had taken from me was his to run, and I had no further interest in its outcomes. James came separately 3 months later and said more honest things in fewer words. He said he had underestimated me, and he said it without qualification. I told him that had been an expensive mistake. He agreed immediately. We talked about the company's early years, the years before his arrival, and something in those conversations felt like the beginning of something real. What I did was competition, conducted legally through proper market mechanisms, funded entirely by the settlement my own founding agreement had entitled me to receive. I built a business from an underperforming acquisition, improved it using decades of accumulated knowledge, grew it through relationships I had spent 38 years earning, and sold it profitably. This is called entrepreneurship. It is what I had been doing since I was 37 years old, long before my sons understood what a supply chain was. The difference between this story and others like it is that I had the means, the experience, and the composure to respond to what was done to me with something more precise than anger. Before you go, one question. If someone removed you from the thing you had spent your life building and handed it to people who believed your age made you replaceable, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments.